things with the foster parent, and I try to hook up the foster parent with the biological parents to work together if they can do a relationship where they can work together. Sometimes they can't because of things. Other times we're trying to build them part of the system, not to be against the parents, but help those parents. And sometimes there's some conflict because maybe that foster parent wants to adopt. So you definitely have that conflict of interest, but we look at that, but we try and integrate it with a much better system to focus on. And the key, in my last comment, is family preservation. If we can keep them out of the system, keep that family together, you avoid a lot of issues that we have. And make sure we only remove those children that absolutely need to be removed. And when you do that, you better say, what is that safety and how does that impact that child immediately that justifies removing that child? And that's what we need to put the emphasis on, keeping those families together. Family preservation, because that will resolve a lot of issues that you went through. If you're able to preserve that family, even with the issues your niece might have had, if you could preserve that family right then and there, with you guys being part of that, they wouldn't have got to those other levels.
Now, I'm asking for this to say, I want to make one comment. Child Protective Services is given unchecked power to go in the courts and make up anything they want to say about the families without any evidence whatsoever.
And they have immunity.
They have immunity.
What I'll do since,
What I'd like to say to you, Ms.
but I'll talk to anybody in the hall if you want to ask me something. You can get a chance to, because I don't want to take up the time. If you want, I'll be glad to take.
What needs to be done is the bonus incentive to the Adoption and Safe Families Act of '97 needs to be abolished, because that is what's going on. It's all about the money. That's what needs to be done. That's where you begin with fixing everything else.
I didn't mean
Right,
to.
what I was trying to suggest, and if we go back to the council with this,
Hillary Clinton wrote
is
that.
to really look at what Child Protective Services gives you as evidence, to really, really look at it.
And see if they make a lot of conclusions, and we need as judges
There's conclusions.
question that and see what the basis is for that, because many times when you put them on
Right, and
to
what
stand, they
evidence-
can't support what they said. It's like, well, wait a minute, that's not really how it came together.
What
But
evidence they really have against the parents. I mean, they need to show that. Just like a parent needs to do in a courtroom against another parent, domestic violence. You need to show that evidence.
and we need to take much more hearings. I can't do 8 hearings in an hour. That gives me 12 minutes of hearing. That's ridiculous.
Right.
We need half hour, 45 minutes, and we're trying to get more judicial resources. And that's why it's so important. We keep that family together, and the only ones you're dealing on is the ones that need to be in the system. Then you can take a half hour, 45 minutes with every proceeding on that. But right now we got such a volume. You're right. We don't question them as much as we should. Absolutely.
That's
So
what my
how-
suggestion was to take to the council.
So how can we, GQ Public, help you get those resources?
Exactly.
You know, as far as that, we have public meetings that we have out there to get involved. We have different committees, if you're interested in committees, legislature, you can talk to your legislators, state legislators, county commissioners, whoever you know on that, to raise those concerns. Was that? Yeah, the county commissioners, I meet with the commissioner weekly, regularly, to try to talk some of those issues on that. But I think to talk to your elected officials that you know and really let them know that we need to talk to those issues. I talk to them to see about trying to get funding or how we can do funding on that. But I think the thing is public awareness, get the word out there and hold the judges accountable. I agree with that.
That's right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just want to make one comment. Your words are very healing to people like ourselves, and we deeply appreciate
I'm honored
your
to be invited here.
perspective.
I'm really honored to be invited here. I'll speak.
Thank you for the work you're doing.
We know he has to leave.
We'd like to keep him, but, you know.
She's good people. You got good people. I'll hang for a little bit.
Okay.
Well, I can't follow him really well. I kind of wanted to go first.
Hard act to follow.
Because number one, I would have been a lot shorter.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
And not quite as dynamic. But I know Melody asked me to come here to talk a little bit about some of what we're doing here in Clark County in advocacy in the child welfare system. So in order to do that, I think I need to give you a little bit of background. And, you know, Jan talked about my background a little bit. I've been doing this work, child advocacy work, for about 14 years here in Las Vegas, and not just child welfare, but looking at issues such as children's health, early childhood education, K-12 education, the gamut. And that actually goes back to what Judge Sullivan said is what we need to look at is preservation. How do we preserve the family provide those supports up front to our families so that they're not coming into the system in the first place. So several years ago, actually, I was invited, there's a group that meets here, it's called the Child Welfare Network. And I don't know if any of you are here that live here in Las Vegas. It's an open community meeting. The next meeting is actually April 12th, if you're interested in participating.
Where?
It's at the Las Vegas Country Club, and it starts at 7:30 in the morning. I'm sorry?
Joe W. Brown,
I'm Joe W. Brown, right behind
the Hill, Dallas, LBH.
the LDH. But that group meets probably on a quarterly basis, and it's, like I say, it's an open group, and it is meant to be a network, a coalition, basically of service providers in the community, advocates, philanthropists. We've had the judge and some of his staff come. So it's really just an open meeting to talk about child welfare issues in our community, to network with other people, to identify not only problems, issues, but also solutions and what we can do to move things forward. So I was invited to that group several years ago because what they wanted to do was look at some policy issues and develop a legislative agenda around child welfare. So that was the first thing that we did, and this is the document that we created for the 2011 legislative session.
And it is called what?
This is the Child Welfare Network's legislative agenda. And essentially what we did, and the process is a lot of work. Essentially you need to sit down with all of these groups, and it's a lot of going back and forth. We have parent representatives there, we have the agency there, really coming up with what are the main issues that we want to address in our state legislature to make a difference in these issues. And we had actually come up with 3. And the first one actually goes back to, I think, your primary issue here, which is the funding. And so the first recommendation that we had made was to do a comprehensive review of our funding system around child welfare. So looking at where that funding was coming from, who it was going to, what it was being used for, and really do an analysis of how effectively that funding is being used. One of the issues that's come up multiple times here in Clark County is the fact that a lot of the funding is so restricted that the agencies aren't able to use that for appropriate prevention services as well. So how can we make some of that funding more flexible when it comes into the system, and use it more broadly for the community-based services to keep those families out of the system in the first place. That recommendation didn't go anywhere. It happened to come during a time when we were going through an economic crisis, and there wasn't a lot of desire to look at that issue. The 2 other recommendations that came through, one was to establish a foster youth bill of rights. That one was taken up by one of our freshman legislators during the last session, and it was passed. And that bill of rights was actually drafted by one of our foster youth groups. So it was former foster youth who came together and created that bill of rights. They used the models from other states and put that together. So we have that piece of legislation now. The third one is actually probably what I'll talk about most, and what we had recommended, and it started actually out of a discussion of the definition of abuse and neglect. And through our discussions, what we recognized is that our definition of abuse and neglect was old. The last time it had been revised was, I think, somewhere in the 80s. Times have changed, things have changed, ideas about what abuse and neglect has changed. So there was a desire to request legislation that would allow changing that definition. What that ended up turning into is a realization that our entire child welfare statutes were antiquated, not coordinated, didn't mesh well with other statutes, didn't mesh well with our regulations, and quite frankly, some of them are just out of compliance with federal law. So what we recommended was an interim study that would allow revisions to our state's child welfare laws, and that's where we're at right now. So that law was passed. It was Senate Concurrent Resolution number 5, if anybody wants to look it up.
I'm sorry, would you repeat that?
Senate Concurrent Resolution number 5. And essentially what that resolution states is that it just required a review of our state's laws that govern child welfare. The bill was passed, and it kind of sat there for a while. I had made a few inquiries about where that was, who was responsible for it, who was doing it. Eventually found out that the bill was passed down to the Legislative Committee on Child Welfare and Juvenile Justice, which is a relatively new, I think they met the previous session during the interim, new committee. Prior to that, any child welfare issues in our state with the state legislature had to go before Health and Human Services. They were compiled with all of the healthcare issues and that, and they weren't really heard. So now we have a separate interim committee that reviews those. After some discussions with the chair of that committee, who's Senator Valerie Weiner, my organization, I offered basically myself to convene community groups around that to present recommendations to that committee. So we're in the process of doing that right now. So essentially what we did, I started putting out a call for people who wanted to be engaged in that process, and that has been open to anyone and everyone who wants to participate. So we have had all three of our child welfare agencies have participated in every meeting. We've had Judge Sullivan been to a couple of those meetings, and some of the hearing masters, Mari Parlayed, Court Skylights and Change, has participated in that. A lot of different parent groups, Melody has been participating in that. We also have a lot of the attorneys there, the service providers there, and really the first meeting was just an open call for what issues do we need to address. What are things that you guys are seeing in the system that we need to change legislatively? Like I said, that was just a brainstorming session. So through that first meeting, what we recognized and what I knew would happen, there were a lot of issues that came up, many of which were not statutory issues. A lot of the things that came up that we identified were policy and practice issues.
Is there a website that someone can set up that people can give feedback towards what we can do to help, as far as what we're dealing with and what we can do?
We're in the process of that. Let me back up a little bit and tell you a little bit about my organization.
Okay.
The Children's Advocacy Alliance has actually been around since 1997, and it has been it's been a nonprofit organization that's primarily been a volunteer board of directors. So they've done events. If any of you are familiar with the Foster Youth Graduation Party that happens every year, so every child who is in foster care who graduates from high school, there's an event to celebrate those accomplishments. Our organization has also set up the Children's Memorial Garden, and that is to make sure that children who are in foster care who pass away have a headstone and a service, because we found that there were many children who did not have that. And we set up the diligent search in the courts. We provided some of the funding for that. We provided some of the initial funding for the Children's Assessment Center. So it was really kind of that, a board, and quite frankly, not myself when I sat on the board, which I did for about 2 years, but many of the others are some of the philanthropists in the community who had some connections to getting some of that funding in place. So that's really what that board was for quite some time. I was actually brought on the board by the chair to come in and look at what the Children's Advocacy Alliance could become, to be an advocacy organization. So we are a member of Voices for America's Children, which is a national organization. Some of the youth from out of state, if you're not familiar with your state's Voices chapter, I would encourage you to go to voices.org. There's a map at the bottom on their homepage. Click on your state and it will give you information, because nearly all of those chapters do child advocacy, or they do child advocacy work, but most of them do it in child welfare, and they would be a fantastic resource for you. So we are working on becoming a full member of Voices for America's Children. I was actually just hired on in February 1st, to serve as the very first executive director of the Children's Advocacy Alliance. We are in the process, we've got a brand new board of directors. We're in the process of bringing on even more, a larger board, so that we have a more diverse board and cover a vast array of issues. So the organization itself is fairly new. So right now, a lot of this work that I'm doing, essentially we don't have a website. We're recreating our website right now. But absolutely, absolutely what our purpose is to be a grassroots child advocacy organization. So we purposely are a private nonprofit. I previously worked in the university. That's where the organization Nevada Institute for Children's Research and Policy was held. I was limited in my ability to do what I would consider to be true advocacy work because I was a state employee. So I educated a lot. I educated for many years. I'm proud to say, and I'm convincing my board that I'll be registering as a lobbyist with the start of the legislative session. So we're truly the first true child advocacy organization in the state of Nevada. And that's not to say that there aren't some other fantastic groups here that are doing some of that work. We've got some other, for those of you familiar with Nevada PEP, they do a lot of advocacy work in our state and represent parents' issues up at the state legislature as well.
Where does your funding come from?
Our funding right now, our initial funding is coming from Casey Family Programs. If you're not very familiar
I'm
with
familiar.
that. Okay. They've been investing some funding here in Southern Nevada for many years. They invested some funds to develop a project that was called Community We Will. And Community We Will was essentially the first product of that was a business case around child welfare. And that is available. If you look, go to communitywewill.org. You can find information about that initiative. The business case that was put together was done by actually one of my partners in my consulting business, which is Cindy Ortiz-Gustafson with Strategic Progress. And it really outlines what is our child welfare system, what do the families look like. Judge Sullivan referenced, 70 to 75% of our kids in our system, families in our system, are there because of neglect. And that much of that has to do with poverty, lack of resources. So we wanted a document that really put that together. What we have done, effective this year, is we actually merged the Children's Advocacy Alliance with the Community We Will and used some of that funding to hire a staff member, which is myself. And then we're actually going after some, we have a private funder who we're working on right now, but has made a commitment to fund us at a higher level to sustain the organization later on. We will be a privately funded.
Privately funded, so you won't get federal monies.
We will not be getting any federal monies. Right now our board is pretty intent on the fact that we won't get any state or county money. We're trying to stay away from government funding. We also
For a conflict, so you will be a conflict of interest?
I will not be a conflict of
Okay,
interest.
I appreciate that.
And we also won't.
I don't know of any advocacy nonprofit out there that is not accepting state monies, and I think
Right,
it's a
and
huge conflict of interest.
And most of the Voices chapters, if you look at their funding sources, there's a mix. So am I telling you right now that we are never going to take any type of contract? I can't say that we're too new right now for me to say that. I can tell you that our board, as it currently exists, is very against us taking any type of government funding whatsoever, nor will they allow us. Nor
I'd like to follow up with
nor will we have any
Thank you, Judge
member
Sullivan.
on our board.
So you said there's going to be no government funding and it's going to be private. So you take these funds from corporations, like corporations that do governmental services fund?
Right now, what I can tell you is our two funding sources are two. The one that's publicly known is Casey Family Programs, which is a private foundation. The other one that we're looking at a much larger gift to sustain us a little bit longer is also a private foundation. Like I said, I can't speak to where, you know, we're walking a fine line with, you know, who we can accept funds from, but also making sure that we have enough funds to continue to do the work that we're doing. Eventually, we've got a fantastic board who have a lot of ties to the philanthropic community here in Southern Nevada. So it's anticipated that most of our funding will come from private philanthropy and donations and private foundations.
You can talk to them too, Denise. They were interested in legislatively that you're working on 432B, which is your main focus.
Right.
As far as
So that's actually
changing that.
going back to the SCR 5, which creates the 432B. So we essentially, I started convening groups back in December. The group's been meeting every 2 weeks. And those who can come. Those that can't. We've been sharing information via email and just getting that out. It's been a difficult process when you've got, you know, say folks like Melody sitting at the table who, you know, they're representing parent interests. You've got DFS and the child welfare agencies, the attorneys who are representing different sides. But even though it's been a difficult process, I think it's been a great process because even though not everything is statutory, not everything that comes out is going to turn into a bill. Some of the other issues that have come up with, you know, policy and practice, what we've identified is it's actually a forum where it started some of those discussions with the community groups and with the child welfare agencies to start having some of those discussions.
I'm pretty familiar with Casey Family Programs up in Washington State who are creating these therapeutic communities where they're developing entire communities and bringing in fake grandparents and fake aunts and uncles and bringing foster kids into this fake community and kind of labeling everybody. And I mean, they're coming up with some really oddball things. And I'm hearing you talk about your treatment of foster children in terms of, you know, giving recognition, etc. What are the plans for prevention and support of families who are struggling? And because you know, I see plenty of people. It's become very vogue to be a foster child supporter, and it's very vogue for not only community agencies but corporations as well. Well, we give to foster kids, and you've got families over here dying and struggling, and they're not making it, and they need help. But all these poor foster kids, you know. And so one of the things that I hear on a pretty regular basis from the other side is that, well, you know, we're not in it for the money, we're not making any money off of these kids, but once they become special needs, and then all this community support, you know, starts to fill in, you know, and they're not counting the gas allowance and the time spent, the extra money that they get for travel time and doing all these other perks that they get, and the clothing allowances and all this stuff. By the time you're done, they're actually making a fair amount, and I've looked at that. And so I'm a little dismayed at all the help of fostering when on the other side of the coin you've got a community that is not helping itself and not helping each other.
I'm going to address that by actually reading a piece of this to you, just to give you an idea of where we're coming from. When we put together the legislative policy agenda, we really wanted to identify a focus, and our primary focus word was prevention. So it's a focus on prevention, and we identified 3 steps: preventing children and families from entering the child welfare system, preventing children from re-entry into the system after reunification, and then preventing involvement with the adult system for youth who are aging out. So that was the premise of this entire document. of this entire agenda as we're moving forward. And having been involved in this arena for, like I say, 14 years, and having been involved, and I can tell you, even looking at the Children's Advocacy Alliance, which I'm involved with now, we had some board members leave when we made this transition because the focus was on foster children, on providing supports to foster children, doing the events and the parties to make their life happy, and from a broader focus, what we determined we wanted to do is be more effective at preserving families. So how do we address the needs of the families? So that is the premise of what our organization is doing and what we're building upon. So are we there yet? Have we done a ton of things? No, but I just started in February, so give me a minute, and I promise I will get some work done. But to address some of your other issues, I can tell you, and I brought this document, obviously didn't bring enough for everyone, but these are a list of the recommendations that our group came up with that were presented to the Legislative Committee on Child Welfare and Juvenile Justice.
Hey, do you mind if we pass that around and everybody can?
No, I'd be more than happy to.
And you said also they go on, I'm sorry, I was back there, voices.org?
Voices.org.
Okay, and people can join?
It's one document, it's not.
It's one document, Shawnee.
Shawnee.
Shawnee, it's one doc, Shawnee.
It's multiple.
Still one document. I don't care how many times you do it.
You've been in the sun too long.
I'm sorry, I
From the sun.
didn't think to bring copies, but that's the list of recommendations as you pass it around, look at it. And I actually, that one has my notes and everything on it, so please ignore some of that. That's some of my working notes. It's probably better.
Good shot, though.
It's probably better if I just go over them with you, and I need to have.
You want a bag?
Look at it.
And a bag, too.
Does anybody want to look at it? I am happy to.
She wants a bag.
I need to try to get. What I'd be happy to do though, is, I don't know, through one of you, and I could even do it tonight, is I can email this document out to you. Feel free to share it. It's a public document. It's been shared before the Legislative Committee. But essentially we're looking at, as I mentioned before, we're looking at the definitions of abuse and neglect. But we also brought up some other issues. Some of them are just technical, some of them are clarity issues, looking at the residence of a child. But essentially, through these recommendations, and there's probably about 30 on here or more, the Legislative Committee identified 10 that they were willing to move forward. Those 10 recommendations, like say, one is the definition of a residence of a child, as they just wanted to clarify on there that the residence of a child is the home that they were removed from and not their foster home. One of the other issues that we've been talking about is waiver of reasonable efforts. And what's come up there and what we've seen in our court system is under federal statute, there's the list of when an agency may waive reasonable efforts. Our state legislature went in and created even more stringent statutes in that area. So we're trying to, and basically what our courts have done is they've seen that they've made rulings that they don't have discretion in that area. So that if the agency comes in and says that they're going to waive reasonable efforts because there was a prior adjudication, the courts have come back and said, okay, we can't change that because the agency doesn't have to do it. Now, I was actually talking to Judge Sullivan about this just before this meeting, and he said that's a policy issue in the courts. That's something that's not a practice that he follows, but he recognizes that some of his hearing masters and some of his predecessors actually followed that. So, we're going to work on that from a practice perspective, but I told him, I said, we're going to try and move forward legislation to make it very clear that the court has jurisdiction or has discretion to require reasonable efforts in those cases. And he's supportive of that.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
We just want to inform that there's no smoking in the conference room. Please,
No smoking.
thank you.
I was told by the guy out there I could, I know you're talking about me.
So anyway, that's one of the areas that we're looking at. The other is basically a definition of reasonable efforts. So there we're looking at some federal.
It's in a lot of
It's a
law.
state law. Casinos only.
Oh, he's wrong.
So,
He'll tell you anything.
one of the other issues that came up, which our legislative committee is not going to address, is appointment of attorneys. And what our group as a whole would like to see is appointment of attorneys for parents at the very beginning of the process, and appointment of attorneys for children at the very beginning of the process. Obviously, that's a huge financial burden on our state. The committee did not take that up. So we're actually in the process of meeting, having a separate group to talk about appointment of representation in these cases and what we're going to recommend and identify an individual sponsor to move those forward. I'm just going to go to some that I think are more applicable to this group. The other one, I'm missing pages.
Oh, the
I'll say the
one
other
that
one is
they
the-
didn't take up, remember, a lot of people didn't realize there are no grandparents' rights in the state, and they are not going to take that up. But I think what the reason that they decided not to take that up is because actually there's actually a law, I think it's under 124 point something, that if you put in under that law, that you have rights. And I think that's part of what's going to go on. People really don't know what they can put under in the court.
Right, and I think that was probably one of the biggest issues from the very beginning, was that the child welfare agencies and some of the attorneys have a very good understanding of the statutes. They deal with them every day, they understand them, they know how they work, they know how to manipulate them, to use them that way. A lot of the other groups, those who hadn't been engaged as long, and I think those representing some of the parents, not necessarily those sitting at the table, but for those people they were representing, the issue that came up is that there's a lack of understanding of where things are, what statutes you need to look at, where do you find the definition for this, where do you go to find this information. That came up very clearly when we were talking about just the definition of abuse and neglect. We started working on how do we define this more clearly, and the child welfare agencies are like, oh, that's in our policies. We've got it all, we've got the allegation definitions defined. And, what we recognize is not everyone had access to that. And they're like, oh, it's on our website. Well, where? How do you dig through that information? So I think one of the things that the child, and giving some credit to the child welfare agencies that were there, they knew where that was. They didn't, I don't think sometimes they recognized the fact that it wasn't as available to everyone. So one of the things that came out of that discussion was how can they make information more readily available to everyone, and that's not an easy task. One of the other issues that came up was just the issue broadly of parental rights. How do you let parents know from the very beginning, from the second that, DFS knocks on the door?
You don't have to answer the door.
Right, but
Yeah.
a lot of parents don't
Yeah,
know that.
and they don't inform them.
Right,
Most parents are just trying to do the right thing,
right.
Right.
And
So-
most parents that are good,
and then they get suckered in.
most good parents don't have anything to hide.
Yeah.
So they think it's okay to let them in their
Right.
house.
So one of the recommendations that has come out of the group, and it's another one that the committee didn't pick up, but we're looking at moving forward as a separate recommendation, is to basically put together an easy to understand pamphlet, require the caseworkers to not only hand that to the parents, but also to explain it to them.
That's huge.
But that should also
You have the right to
Yeah.
not open the door. You have the right to not speak to me. You have the right to have this recorded. You have the right to have a witness.
It's very similar to, if a police officer knocks on your door.
Yeah, it's entrapment is what it
They
is.
have to tell you if you're arrested and before the police officer can question you, you have to be read your Miranda rights. It's a very similar situation. So we're looking at different options. And, very interesting, I think the last meeting, the group was really talking about different options for that, recognizing that not all caseworkers are going to do the best job of explaining that to parents, whether they're, they can say, here, these are your rights, and maybe list two and feel that they met that.
At least it'll help.
At least it will help, but also looking at other options. So in places like the Southern Nevada Health District, when you go in there, a lot of people go in there for immunizations and checkups and things. It's their local public health authority. They have TV monitors. So how can we get different information out in different avenues to families about what their rights are? So that's something that we're in the process of looking at.
We're doing that in Utah. It's called the Bill of Rights, and it goes to the parents immediately. That's what we're working on. And it also, Representative Chris Watkins in Utah has passed a law that has to be in place.
Maybe you can email that Utah law to Denise.
Yeah, if I can get her email, I'd be more than happy.
Yeah,
with
I'll be happy to do
Yeah.
Exactly.
Maybe we
You
should
have the right
create
to
a handbook for
Yes.
parenting.
When they snatch them right at birth. Yeah.
No, they mean the parents that are
Look up
having.
the video, Don't Mess with Texas CPS, it's a very good example.
When you're pregnant.
What's that, Mickey?
Don't mess with Texas CPS, look at that video.
I'll get it out.
You'll cry.
Shouldn't there be repercussions for people who make false aggregations against an innocent person?
Especially if it's the end of
Without
the
a
day.
child
Then
that
I'm
died
gonna be
inside the
dealing with that one when I talk.
Sorry.
Those are gonna be
Criminal to file false allegations against someone, but the problem is that when those false allegations are made, everybody believes it's with good intent.
Well, but it's
So
anonymous.
when it's false.
And it's anonymous.
When it's false, I'm gonna get to the anonymous, because Lord knows I've had my.
Excuse me, I'll be dealing with that. I'm gonna be talking soon, and I'm gonna be dealing with all that.
Okay.
So that might help a little bit.
But it's a criminal act for someone to make false allegations. But nobody takes the time to enforce that law. Nobody cares. That, when I had Henderson police break through my dining room window because a neighbor who was selling drugs that I reported to the landlord called the police saying I locked my son in a closet. And they destroyed my home while my son was at daycare and I was at school.
I guess my rights leaving.
There was nothing that I could do.
So we gotta go through some
These
reasons.
calls continue, and they continue. And then I spanked my son in 2006 with a belt, and all of a sudden I'm being charged with a felony, and they're using these false calls against me in order to keep their case. And then, to touch base on the medical issue, they had me speak with a marriage and family therapist for 20 minutes that wrote in paperwork diagnosing me as narcissistic borderline personality disorder, which was submitted in court documents. But in order for me to contest it, I had to pay for a psychiatric evaluation as a single mother of a disabled child and a college student, that I was supposed to pay out of pocket for a psychiatric evaluation, in which I would have to go, not only is it just going and taking a test, you have to go to repeated meetings, visits with a psychiatrist, week after week after week, and then you go and do the evaluation. And then you have to go back, and every single one of those meetings is money out of your pocket. You don't have medical insurance, you don't have cash, you have nothing. And then when you don't do it, DFS now says you're not compliant with the case plan.
They want you to fail, because that's automatic
That's what they want you to
$6,000
do.
for your job.
It's like Jansen, use
Exactly,
it
and
as a
my child was
prosecution.
already special needs.
Automatic.
That should be administered to both parents in a custody type court type thing.
Well, I think they're working on that